Okay, hello everybody. Um, for the HBL, we're going to continue basically PRC's foreign policy with the Soviets, especially during the Cultural Revolution. Then later on, we will examine China's foreign policy with the Americans. All right. Now, so what happened to Sino-Soviet relations during the Cultural Revolution? The last time we finished our lesson, we acknowledged that basically there was a Sino-Soviet split that was basically occurring. There were tensions between Mao and Khrushchev. But by the time we come to the Cultural Revolution, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev lost his power in the Soviet Union, and later on, as you know your Cold War history, Brezhnev took over. But of course, Mao was still around. But later on, you will realize that Zhou Enlai would be one of the key diplomats for China. Now, what happened to Sino-Soviet relations? Well, it did not improve during the Cultural Revolution, right? So, with the launch of the first space satellite, the Soviet Union was now worried that the PRC had the potential to develop ICBMs. So, if you could recall, they already have uh, developed the atomic bomb, they have developed hydrogen bomb, and now with satellite, what it meant was that they now could guide their missiles, basically the intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so basically this present a threat to the Soviet Union. Now, then we come to 1968, the Brezhnev Doctrine. Now, Mao basically feared Brezhnev, and one of the reasons why he was quite concerned with Brezhnev was the doctrine that we learned last year, the Brezhnev Doctrine that occurred in 1968. And basically, according to the Brezhnev Doctrine, the Soviet Union would ensure that a country once communist would stay that way, and the Soviets, if need be, would use force. Now, why were the Chinese apprehensive? Because of the fact that the Soviets could use force. The question really was that what's the Soviet going to use force against China if China was going to disagree with certain issues with the Soviet Union? So that was something that, of course, Mao was concerned about. And so during the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, when the Soviets basically used force against the people in Czechoslovakia, Mao condemned the USSR's use of force, even though USSR was trying to, in some sense, ensure that Czechoslovakia would remain under its communist influence. But the fear really was that if the Soviets could use force against Czechoslovakia, does it mean that the Soviets could rationalize and also use force to take action in Chinese territory? And so that was the concern. And then the lowest point came in the Sino-Soviet border war in 1969. Now, the two countries shared a 7,000 km border, and between 64 to 69, there were a lot of incidents and skirmishes between the Chinese and Soviet troops, whereby they basically exchanged fire. But basically, March 1969, there was intense fighting between the PRC and the USSR, which erupted on the Damascus island in the Usuri River. And of course, later on, there was even a serious war and outbreak of fighting in Xinjiang. And word had also gotten to Mao that the Soviet Union was thinking about using a surgical strike against Chinese nuclear weapon installation, because of course you want to take out the nuclear weapons first, then you can basically have the upper hand. And so the Sino-Soviet border war really represent the lowest point in Sino-Soviet relations. But with the PLA basically preoccupied during the Cultural Revolution, basically it got the Chinese leaders to start thinking, okay, how can we address this tension with the Soviet Union? And one of the interesting consequences of the Sino-Soviet split was that maybe it's time for China to form better relations with the USA. So this is a very interesting consequence. Okay, anyway, these are some photographs. Chinese soldiers, okay, are fighting during the Sino-Soviet border war 1969. Now, when we think about the reasons why the relation changed from being friendly to being one that is filled with tension, I mean, look at this May 2013 question. Can they ask this question? It discusses a command term that is acceptable. So it is possible. Why is the endpoint 69? Because basically the marker hopes that you talk about events all the way to the Sino-Soviet border war in 69. So this is a possible outline that you can consider. Obviously, you need to talk about why the Soviets and the Chinese were friendly initially in the 1950s. Because at the start they signed the Treaty of Alliance and they wanted to help one another because they were communists, right? And of course, one event that brought them closer together in some sense was the Korean War. Then you can talk about one reason why it moved from friendly to tense. And you can even start off with the Korean War, because when you think about even the treaty itself and the Korean War, already there were tensions brewing between Mao and Stalin. And Mao was quite upset by some of the terms of the treaty. Mao was upset that Stalin did not provide enough troops to fight the war. And the Chinese had even to take a loan from the Soviet Unions while they were pouring in their own troops. So Mao was quite upset. But as mentioned by one of the historians that we learned, that basically Mao had deep respect for Stalin. And even though there were tensions and so forth, basically Mao saw Stalin as the leader of the communist movement. But really, when with the death of Stalin, then ideological differences start to emerge. Okay, so you can talk about the death of Stalin, you can talk about the rise of Khrushchev, you can talk about the secret speech made by Khrushchev, and then, of course, the certain events, the Taiwan Strait crisis, that highlight ideological differences, whereby Khrushchev wanted peaceful coexistence, whereas for Mao wanted to use force or use military might to really drive home the point that they were against capitalism. And of course, you can talk about other events that might actually cause tensions between China and USSR. So, for example, quickly forward, Khrushchev criticizing so-called Mao. Of course, Khrushchev's visits to the US, again, a lot of criticisms by Mao. You can talk about Albania as well. You can talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can talk about then the Brezhnev Doctrine. Mao increasingly worried about the Brezhnev Doctrine. And of course, ending off with the Sino-Soviet border war conflict. And so many other events that obviously add on and led to relations worsening. All right. So something to think about when you think about this question. Now, let's move on, and we're going to look at a consequence of the Sino-Soviet split. And one of the interesting consequences of the Sino-Soviet split was actually improvements in Sino-American relations, especially during the period of the Cultural Revolution. All right, so let's go. Now, during this period, of course, there was a new president. Nixon was the new president, and of course, Kissinger was his advisor. And the two of them basically decided that maybe they need to relook at their foreign policy and see how they can take advantage of the Sino-Soviet conflict that was occurring. And is there a way to basically establish better relations with PRC? And is there a way to establish better relations also with the USSR? And through having better relations with the PRC, can I then therefore get out of Vietnam? Because at that point in time, remember, the US was stuck in Vietnam, and increasingly there was unhappiness over the Vietnam War within the Americans. And so basically, he wanted to change US position regarding communist China. So some things that Nixon did, allowing Americans to travel to China, allowing the export of grain as well. And basically, this was intended to send a message to the Soviets that the USA will not be that neutral if the Soviets attack China. And this, in some sense, worked for China, in some sense, worked in favor with China. And for Nixon, basically, the whole idea was belief or this concept of triangular diplomacy. And you can look at the bottom, you can see the Sino-Soviet split occurring. So there is tensions between Soviet Union and China. But what that tension meant was that since both of them are not in good terms, they are going to basically have better terms with the USA. Because if you don't have better terms with the USA, the fear was that you will be isolated. And so, interestingly, one of the consequences of the split was better relations with the USA. And Nixon could see this. And Nixon took advantage of this to try to improve relations with the Soviet Union and with China. Now, also at that time, Mao, which interestingly, before that was so against USA, was now more willing to improve its relations with the USA. Okay, he wanted to undermine the USSR as they resented the Soviet policies of détente and peaceful coexistence, which is mind-boggling when you think of it, because the USSR was promoting peaceful coexistence in the West, and now the same policy, in some sense, that China has been attacking, now China wants to support it because now it's about having good relations with the USA. So a big question we sometimes ask is Mao a realist in foreign policy? Is he a hypocrite? Or maybe both in some sense, right? Because once you are a realist and you form good relations with USA, in some sense you're betraying your own so-called original belief that you had. But anyway, as history goes, that's what Mao did. And the PRC saw Soviet tactics to draw close to the West as an attempt to leave China isolated. And so, since Soviets are now also drawing closer to the West, Soviets are drawing closer to the USA. Remember, it's the period of Dayton. PRC felt, okay, fine, we're going to try to draw closer with the USA to outplay the USSR at its own game by achieving Sino-American détente. So really, realist in some sense. This is really a pragmatist, real politics in some sense. And of course, you can see it doesn't matter that you were once my enemy. Now I'm going to make use of my former enemy to upset my former friend, which has interestingly became my enemy. Wow, complex, love triangle. Now, obviously, both Nixon and Mao also wanted to check Soviet expansion and were troubled by the Brezhnev doctrine and Soviet's nuclear strength. Both were concerned about the lengthy war in Vietnam. Nixon, in particular, was very concerned. He had promised in his elections that he will find a way to get out of Vietnam. And so, if he could ally with China, maybe Mao could persuade the North Vietnamese to find a way to end the Vietnam War, and so that USA can leave Vietnam in somewhat honorable manner. And both wanted to restore some kind of order in their respective countries as well. So from 71 onwards, you will see that there is better relations. And interestingly, it starts off with some kind of cultural diplomacy, okay, whereby the US table tennis team visited the PRC, ushering the era of ping pong diplomacy. And if you watch the movie Forrest Gump, okay, and Forrest Gump is playing ping pong, okay, that was supposed to signify ping pong diplomacy and the improvement in relations between the two countries. Okay, so this is Time magazine, China, a whole new game, and of course you can see the American team at the Great Wall of China. Now, then in July 1971, Kissinger traveled to Pakistan. And then, like some, spy film or whatever, he claimed to have a stomach ache. He disappeared from public view. But what actually happened was that basically from Pakistan, there was a Chinese delegation waiting for him that transported him to China, where he met Zhou Enlai. And basically, according to Chinese records, Kissinger offered a number of enticement to the Chinese government, okay, and basically promised that we will get PRC accepted into the UN and full diplomatic recognition by 75. Nixon was re-elected in 72. In fact, this was the promise made, but PRC actually entered the UN even much earlier than 75. And of course, they discussed full withdrawal from Indochina Vietnam War, and Kissinger informed China of Soviet troop deployments on its border. So, this was an interesting meeting, and of course, it really Kissinger was that master diplomat, trying to form better relations with China. Now, during the Cultural Revolution, thankfully we have Zhou Enlai, and he was recognized as the outstanding international statesman. He was concerned about improving China's economy. China's economy wasn't doing that well during the Cultural Revolution, and of course, if there were better relations with U.S., could it lead to basically an increase in world trade, an increase in investments, and so Zhou was concerned about these issues. And of course, that finally led to this very important symbolic visit of Nixon to China, February 1972. All right. And this is the very famous so-called picture whereby, as they were eating, Nixon was introduced to the use of chopsticks, which, of course, was not an easy utensil to master. And there you can see Zhou Enlai next to Nixon. But this was a huge PR success, okay, for America, also for China. Okay, you can see Nixon looking at his piece of, I guess, meat, right? Studying it. Oh, I can use chopsticks. Yeah. Now, of course, here you can see Nixon shaking hands with Mao, remember this occurring during the Cultural Revolution, and basically the improvement in relations was amazing in some sense. Now, with the visit, then basically it led to the normalization of relations and diplomatic recognition, all right? And here the US acknowledged that all Chinese on either side of Taiwan Strait maintained there's only one China. Here's where the one China policy came about, and that Taiwan is part of China and affirmed its intention to withdraw in due course its military from Taiwan, at least the intention. So, something positive coming out. Of course, it feels that U.S. had kind of like abandoned its ally, Taiwan. All right, and so unfortunately, in 1971 October, PRC formally entered into the UN, and Taiwan expelled from the UN. So sad day for the Taiwanese, or the Republic of China. Okay, is it unfair? Well, is debatable, but I think we all have to accept now, whether or not you think it's unfair to Taiwan or not. I think most countries in the world will recognize the PRC as the legitimate government and the state and country. And of course, Taiwan is no longer in the UN, all right? Now, what are some effects of this improvement in Sino-US relations? Now, initially, there was a spurt in the growth of American trade with China, but by 75, they realized that it's not that so-called great. It will take time. Okay, it will take time for it to grow, and it will only really grow once Deng Xiaoping start to open up China. So you can see there was trade, but not that high, and basically, just small, substantial improvement. Only US 1 billion. And what happened was that, remember, this was the end of the Cultural Revolution. And there was a conflict between the leftists, okay, Jiang Qing, the Gang of Four, and the rightists. And that meant that basically China's focus, at least the leaders' focus, was on the internal conflict. And basically, this was the period of time whereby, of course, later on Mao would pass on. And so foreign affairs assumed secondary importance. Okay, so that is in some sense, at least the short-term impact was not that great. For the USSR Brezhnev, he was quite alarmed by the fact that America and China was growing closer. And that interestingly led him to sign the SOT 1 in May 1972. All right. And so good relations with between China and USA led to also good relations between USSR and USA. And shortly after that, Brezhnev also participated in the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, leading to the Helsinki Accords in 75. And of course, by 1st January 1979, the USA officially recognized the PRC as the legitimate government of China with full diplomatic relations. And of course, this left Taiwan in diplomatic limbo. All right. Okay, that comes to the end of my lesson. When we come back, we will discuss this question and see how, if this come out in the exam, what are some possible ways to answer this question. So remember to complete your MCQ questions and do that short answer. All right, thank you and have a good day.